Hello. Well, we are the opening act to the panel which is coming, and the powers that be told us you can do whatever you want for 15 minutes, but after 15 minutes you got to be quiet. So Secretary Work and I are going to go back and forth a little bit talking about the task force that we co-chaired on behalf of the Reagan Institute into the National Security Innovation Base. I'm going to jump into it because Bob is going to start talking about in a moment about some of our recommendations. I do want to give a little bit of an interview as to an overview as to exactly what this was. So we had 13 members on the task force. We were the co-chairs. And we had 4 sitting members of Congress. I see a couple of them here. I see Mr. Kim here and Mr. Gallagher you saw on the video, and Ms. Murphy and Mr. Banks. And we're very grateful to them for giving of their time and also arranging for nice rooms in the Capitol for us to meet in. We had 15 senior advisors, 13 formal briefers. We had a lot of other meetings as well, 6 formal meetings. We studied the National Security Innovation Base, tried to define it, which was the first difficult task. What is it? What is the National Security Innovation Base? We studied China's system, its strengths and weaknesses. We looked at the Department of Defense's current innovation policy, and we're very pleased at the level of activity in the department and commitment to innovation, although we have recommendations about how they can do it better. We looked at workforce issues, got briefings from higher ed, and others in the workforce tech community. And then we met with allies and partners to see how they're doing innovation and how they want us to do it differently, and decided that the question we had to answer was essentially how can we better organize and coordinate the National Security Innovation Base ecosystem so as to pursue more effectively the priorities of national security technology without doing it in a way that straitjackets or suffocates the dynamism that is the chief strength of the system. And we answered that in a 20-page, well, it's longer than that, but the body of the report is about 20 pages. I'd urge you to read. We deliberately did not want to write a book which would have to have an executive summary up front. This is accessible, it is readable, I think, and we have 5 top recommendations, and I'll defer to Secretary of Work now to talk about 2 of them, 2 or 3 of them.
Well, one of the things we wanted to do, we had a lot of discussion, is we wanted to explain the stakes of the competition as we saw that. And that's why we called the report a contest with our primary competitor, or technological competitor. This is the first time the United States has been faced with a high-tech authoritarian competitor. And you saw this morning, for those of you who were at the breakfast this morning, you know, our younger citizens tend to see China in a more as an ally. And we wanted to explain the stakes of this technological competition. And we came up with kind of 5 big ideas. What I want to do, we'll go a little bit out of order on what we have up here, but one of them was we want to win the war on talent. Now, there's a lot of different discussions on whether you have a digital core or a cyber core. And essentially we said, look, we are generating a lot of talent out of our universities and education system, but we are not attracting enough of that talent into the government and to the Department of Defense. So the idea of the STEM Corps was to use the Reserve Officer Training Corps and the National Guard as an exemplar, and to offer full rides for those young men and women who wanted to go into certain disciplines like computer science, mathematics, software engineering, etc. They would get a full ride. We had an active component where some people would go in and be assigned to specific billets in either a government cabinet agency, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, or would go into the Department of Defense. And so that really was focused on trying to attract more talent into the government and the Department of Defense. Another one that really went along with this was the NSIB visa. The H-1B visa process we view as one tool in our toolbox, but it's declining. It's not being used very much. 1/4 of the new or continuing applications in the last 3 months of 2018 were denied. And we felt very strongly that we wanted to remain the magnet for the world's talent. And so the idea was, although this is a very fraught political subject, we thought that one thing that people might agree on was a special visa with expanded enhanced authorities to attract talent in these high-skilled areas. And you would have different vetting standards, for example, for those who wanted to go into university and possibly be faculty, or go into the commercial sector, or go into the government. But we felt this is something that Congress would be able to tackle and would have a material impact on making sure that we have the best talent in the world so that we can win this contest for innovation.
Okay, we're doing pretty well. Less than half the time used at this point. And a lot of these recommendations, of course, interact. Bob's right. What we're concerned that with the pool of talent isn't big enough and that we're not drawing effectively into the national security ecosystem, if you will, the talent that we have. Now, there are some programs out there. We looked and really endorsed Tackers for Defense, for example. There are programs out there that are encouraging and causing cross-pollination within the department and the tech community. And that's going to make it easier to get ability over time, but we wanted to spur that process. So another concern that we have, and this is really true of almost every major subject of national security that cuts across agency lines, which is most of them, including this issue, is a failure, a lack of sufficient coordinating mechanisms, particularly within the executive branch. So you have a number of different agencies that work on different aspects of the innovation issue and work with different parts of the innovation ecosystem. And how do you get them to coordinate and work together as they try and change incentives or make priorities or the rest of it? And our government is really not structured very well to do this job consistently. So you have to try and develop new means of achieving the coordination, but again, without the straitjacking. This can't become a command and control thing, or it won't work. I mean, you'll get enormous resistance within the rest of the ecosystem. We came up with the idea of the National Security Innovation Committee. Structurally, it is modeled after CFIUS, very different in terms of what it's trying to do. But we have top political leadership in a number of different agencies that would be chaired by the Secretary of Defense or the DepSec, one of the top political appointees, because the department controls, I think, most of the money and probably has the biggest interest of all the agencies. But Commerce would also be represented at State, of course, the IC, the National Security Council. There would all be stakeholders, would meet regularly, and the idea is to identify common priorities in national security technologies, make certain that each agency is in its own area, putting money against that, and then submitting to the Congress a unified budget so that Congress well, I think Congress would be very supportive, so that Congress can see where money is being spent on innovation all across the executive branch and also produce an annual report for the Congress. And our hope is that this will be established either legislatively or could be done by executive or I guess. And over time, it's not going to come out of the gate doing everything as well as we would want it to do, but over time, this will be a very useful mechanism for coordinating and prioritizing across the executive branch and giving Congress one go-to body, if you will, or more or less one that they can go to for accountability purposes.
This was one of the ones that we probably debated the most, because none of us wanted to have a huge bureaucracy set up and have some kind of centralized Stalinistic approach to this. Well,
I think it's fair to say that the members and the former member there were probably asked the most questions and we're the most skeptical because we've seen these things created before and not do anything, but at the same time, several of the members have experience in the executive branch and really thought this would be a good thing, and Secretary Work felt strongly about it.
Yeah, the key thing is we're going up against a competitor that has a very top-down driven approach to innovation. It's civil-military fusion, as you saw in the clip prior to us coming up. The Communist Party picks national champions, and they say we want to lead in smart cities, we want to lead in AI, we want to lead in 5G, we want to lead in autonomous vehicles, and they throw enormous resources towards these national champions to go after it. And we did not want to duplicate that. We think the strengths of our innovation ecosystem, the federated system, is very, very innovative and has proven over the long term to be better than a top-down driven. That said, we were against a low-tech authoritarian competitor that can compete with us in niche areas like nuclear weapons and space, but in terms of the broad capabilities of technology, they simply couldn't keep up with us. That's not the case now. So we were trying to come up with something, as Senator Talent said, where we would be able to have more coordination and collaboration without having an enormous bureaucracy. So as the senator said, we kind of use CFIUS as not a perfect analogy, but that's what we were going for, exploiting the staffs that already exist and over time having this process build up so that we would be able to go after specific areas where we felt we were going.
Okay, now Bob, we turn it into pumpkins in 3.5 minutes.
Right.
And I want you need to talk about the partnership.
Yep.
This is a really exciting.
Now the second one is we wanted to win the war for talent. We wanted to, we might not be able to talk about it, but we wanted to inject more risk tolerance in everything we do to become more entrepreneurial, but we wanted to exploit our allies and our partners.
Yeah, just jump in. I know I told you to talk, but the report has a package of DOD recommendations. We sort of packaged them under one priority, and I think they're good. Take a look at them if you have an interest in that area, because I think they may get picked up on. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you all know about the National Technological Industrial Base, the NTIB. That is where the United States, Canada, UK, and Australia are moving towards a regime in which they're considered one integrated industrial base. And we said, look, that's a really good model to use here. We were briefed by Edward Ferguson from the British Embassy, and they said 1% of the British defense budget is dedicated to just waving their way through US regulations. It's incredible. $500 million a year to do that. And what the idea is to build up the NTIB, this partnership for a strong innovation base, and it will give us two big advantages. One, we'll be able to move more seamlessly among our allies and hopefully get away from all the regulations that are just an impediment to innovation and forward progress. But second, going up against the Chinese AI contest, for example, they have an enormous advantage in data in terms of facial recognition, for example. But if you really expanded the partnership for a strong industrial base and we were all able to pool our data, then we would be able to ameliorate some of the advantages the Chinese might have.
This is, a lot of this technology is global. Everybody agrees on that. And right now, we are, we're taking on board a lot of the risks that come from the fact that this technology is being worked on globally, but we are not maximizing some of the opportunities that are available to us because of partnerships with countries that we work very closely with in other areas. So, you have Five Eyes where we trust and work closely as partners with many allies, and it just didn't seem to us to make sense not to begin exploring step by step a new arrangement whereby we could be cooperating and getting synergies in terms of technology. And we've done that to some degree with NTIB, and we want to expand it. So please, if
Could I say one thing before we go?
You got 30 seconds.
As a task force, National Security Commission for AI, we have a staff of about 30 or 40 full-time staff and another 20 SMEs, subject matter experts. The staff for this task force was really one person. It was Rachel Hoff.
Yeah, Rachel.
I don't know if Rachel's here. She was essentially, did all of the staffing, did all of the research, and did all of the writing. And I just want to give a shout out for her because essentially she was doing the work of about 20 or 30 or 40 people. It was pretty incredible.
So I would encourage, here, here. So we would encourage you to have a look. It's accessible, and we think there are a lot of good ideas in it.
To continue with the conversation, please welcome Pentagon reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Gordon Lubold, and our distinguished panelists.
Sir?
Okay. I guess these things are on. Welcome, everybody.
Am I up here?
Be polite.
Thanks for being here. We wanted to continue the conversation after that great presentation. I would echo what I think Jim said, that it is a very crisp, interesting report with a lot of ideas in there, a lot of information, a lot to absorb. But it's also seems to me, as a reporter who looks at a lot of different things, very accessible. So anyway, I wanted to just introduce our panel here today. We've got about 30 minutes to kind of crunch through some of this stuff. And we have three individuals who kind of come at this. If the U.S. is trying to build a stool, we got kind of three pieces of the stool here. Anyway, Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts to my right, Leanne Correa from Boeing to my further right, and then Secretary Ryan McCarthy from the Army all the way down there. What I thought we could just do is take a couple quick minutes from each of you. Give a couple quick minutes, and then Secretary McCarthy, you get 15, because I know you're going to want a little extra time. That's supposed to be a joke. A couple quick minutes just to kind of respond to what you just heard Bob and Jim talk about, and then we can get to some questions. So, Congressman, you want to just start kind of what did that make you think? Where you sit on all this?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just say it's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel and to be back at the Reagan Defense Forum, so thank you very much for having me. First of all, look, this is exactly the kind of work that we need to be doing, and it's the work that Congressman Jim Banks and I are co-chairing on the Future Defense Task Force on the House Armed Services Committee to look at what we need to do to evolve the DoD to meet a new generation of threats. Because there's no question that the nature of warfare has changed, and I think as a result, the nature of deterrence is changing. And we're not really prepared, we're not ready right now for the big fight with China that's coming. And it's one of those things that when you look at the classified picture, the story is worse than what you see in the newspaper. So we have a lot of work to do, and just simply doubling down on the existing paradigms that have served us well for the past several decades is not going to be enough. The first thing I would say with regards to the report is that I agree with the recommendations. I think that they make sense. There's nothing I saw up there on the board that I fundamentally think is pushing us in the wrong direction. The second point I'd make, though, is that it's not enough just to say what more we need to do. Bigger things that we need to buy, new committees we need to set up, or other investments that we need to make. We've got to have a tough conversation about what we need to cut in order to get there. And I want to hold out the Commandant of the Marine Corps as an example of someone who has started that very difficult conversation with the Marine Corps. And when you look at his planning guidance, he doesn't just say that we're going to invest in these new capabilities. He makes it very explicit that he's going to cut capabilities that we no longer need. And that's how we afford to make these kinds of investments. The third thing I'd say is that one of the things that Congressman Banks and I and the rest of the task force are very squarely focused on is not just what do we need to do in 2019 to be a little bit more prepared for the future, but what do we need to change about the fundamental culture of DoD? And by the way, maybe the culture of the DoD congressional relationship, so that 10 years from now we don't have to stand up another Future of Defense task force. So that we get to the point that we're always thinking 20 or 30 years ahead when we're making these critical investments and decisions for our national security.
Great. Man, please.
Thank you, and again, thank you all so much for having us on the panel today. I wanted to start by actually recognizing all of our World War II veterans. Today is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and having the service chiefs here this morning, we'll hear from Secretary Esper at lunch today, really just reminds us about why we're all here. And I don't think there's any better forum in the world to be at on a day such as today. To let Senator Talent feel good, I actually have read the panel's report multiple times, and I am usually one of those folks that looks for the executive summary at the beginning of a report. It is very well written, it's very articulate, it highlights what needs to be done both through the lens of STEM as well as innovation. As that shared, I too agree fundamentally with not only the issues that have been identified, but in terms of the general principles about the way to go forward. From an industry perspective, the war on talent is our #1 fight. We have to hire for mission. You heard that today in multiple forms. This is about the higher calling that we, as part of the defense and space, in the aerospace industry, have to attract and recruit. But even more important, we have to be able to retain. And part of retaining is continuing to keep that development, that pipeline going. So training doesn't stop when you bring someone in the door. It's about continuing this journey. And then breaking over to the innovation arm, which I think also helps with the recruitment. Innovation tends to be spoken about in terms of new technology. That's the sexy stuff that everybody likes and admires, but I actually think it's a little bit bigger than that. It's not just the technology, but as we look to the future, it's about how do we design and manufacture to break the test of time and to break the paradigm of cost. Because if we don't figure out how to do that, there isn't really going to be an ability to take that new technology and make it real. And then finally, business model innovation. And this was really key in this report, because it wasn't just about being able to share data and having the right conversations amongst allies and other nations, but it is about how do we look through intellectual property? How do we take some of that new technology? How do we share it? How do we make certain that there's more access to it? And so this report as a whole did all of that, and we're very supportive of it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Gordon, for the discussions starting this morning, leading me up to this stage, one of the things we talked a lot about is the increase in defense budgets. Because you look at the challenges in the world that are just from an Army perspective, I'll be parochial, of course, genetically incapable not to be. But we're 60% of combatant commanders' requirements worldwide. And yet we're in a flat fiscal environment over the last 3 years as a service. So when you look at the balance sheet is 60% of people and operations and maintenance, you're very limited to modernize the force and meet national objectives as we send units out of the forward operating base in Afghanistan as I speak. So it makes a complex challenge. So what we tried to do as a service over the last 2.5 years, largely inspired by a lot of the work that Secretary Carter and Secretary Work did at the tail end of the Obama administration with DIU and others, was to scale a modernization organization that has a particular emphasis on requirements and investments. So we restructured, we locked in against 6 investment priorities. We moved 80% of our S&T funding against those development of those systems, as well as now we're going to be north of half of the procurement. But we did it because of the hard choices. We went within our investment portfolio and we truncated the buys of 93 systems and killed 93 others. So when you look at it from that standpoint, we had nothing but hard choices because we have to do both. So from an organizational standpoint, the most complex restructuring in 50 years for the Army, creating a 4-star command, and we put them in the middle of an American city, Austin, Texas. They don't wear uniforms. They're on a college campus and an accelerator hub. So we can get the relationships with business and academia that we've enjoyed as an institution for decades. But the culture in the Department of Defense, anytime we meet with the defense industry folks, it's for the last 20 years has been, you got to have a lawyer in the room, and what are you going to talk about? And you can't perform business-to-business relationships and be successful if you're afraid to talk to somebody. This is hard stuff, and we got to be able to do it together. When I think it was former Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates said, "What's good for General Motors is good for the Department of Defense." Former Vice Chairman of General Motors, but if you look at it from that standpoint, the relationships were very close. Culturally, we have to get closer with academia and business to close down the span time for development of those systems. But more so than anything, we got to have budget increases to deal with the challenges we face in the world.
Got it. So, I mean, I'm always struck by the kind of the cultural things. I want to kind of ask everybody to kind of expand on these kind of cultural challenges. I think everybody kind of touched on it in a certain way. But particularly, Congressman Wilson, I mean, so from your own service and from where you sit now, kind of like slightly in the cheap seats looking at the Pentagon, a little bit more than those who are inside it. What do you think are the biggest cultural challenges that DoD has to overcome? And is there a congressional role here to help? And is there a danger or peril of congressional help mucking it up?
Well, there's no question that personnel and talent management is huge. And you saw that in this report. We talk about it a lot. I know, the Secretary is very, very, conscious of this. But when I, to go back to my own experience, I showed up as a Marine Corps infantry officer, and I had a degree from Harvard in physics, and that was a negative because my company commander didn't like it, and it was probably a
He
negative.
didn't like what you mean, where you came from, just didn't reject it.
I mean, there's a resentment there,
Interesting.
right? It certainly was not helpful for promotions whatsoever. I have a good friend who I served with who got into a Princeton PhD program, and the Marine Corps told him he couldn't go. And General Petraeus actually had to intervene from the Army and say, you're making a huge mistake here, and he got to go. But that will probably hurt his ultimate promotion ability because that's not the way that we promote people. You have to follow the system. At the end of my first tour in Iraq, I was doing an interesting job working with the Iraqi media, which wasn't exactly my training, but it was very important in post-war Iraq. The Marine Corps believed that a democracy needed a free press, maybe a lesson for some of the administration, but in any event, it was something that we really believed in, and we were working hard on it, and the State Department asked me to stay, and my battalion commander said, no, that's not what lieutenants do, you're coming back with us. It wasn't in the interests, it wasn't in my interest for career promotion to stay, but it was certainly in the interests of the strategy we were trying to pursue in Iraq, and yet that wasn't the goal. So just with those few anecdotes from my own very limited military experience, I can tell you that we're not valuing all the skills that we need to compete in this new world. We've given promotion authorities to the services from the Armed Services Committee to pull in people from the private sector. To do direct commissioned officers like the way we did in World War II for highly talented individuals because we know we need these people, and I don't think that the services have exercised this authority at all. Right now, if you want to hire an IT security person, sort of like a cybersecurity expert, the starting salary in the private sector is somewhere between $90,000 and $150,000. If you want to come in and do that direct commission to being an O1, it's a $38,500 salary. It's just not competitive. So I think that's one big bucket, and I'll leave it at that so other people can talk. But that's certainly something you see reflected in this report. It's something that Congress can help, and we've got to deliver authorities. But part of the point of this task force, again, is to figure out why is the DoD, even with some of these authorities, not actually putting them into practice.
Ryan, use the Army as a punching bag. One could argue that the Army is a poster child, or the 9 mil. We love to talk about the 9 mil acquisition.
I'd like to write
process.
about it too. I know.
9 years to get a new 9 mil, I think. And then Chief Milley half joked that he could go to Cabela's with a bunch of money and buy the guns and get it.
He was actually serious, Gordon.
Yeah, I think I would. This is kind of like a symbolic thing that I know that current leadership is trying to kind of combat. But there are cultural issues there. There's like way too many requirements that bog things down. But if you would, you can talk about Army Futures Command a little bit, but also about how you change the culture and the wiring inside the Army to get to where you think you need to be.
So Congressman Moulton hit the nail on the head. There have been authorities for the last 4 National Defense Authorization Acts related to business practices, as well as unique tools for recruitment for pretty extraordinary skill sets like he was describing. With respect to the business practices, these other transactional authorities to expedite the sale of a prototype is incredibly valuable. We're utilizing that, and it's attracting non-traditional type of companies. Microsoft is the lead for developing our integrated visual augmentation system, for example. Not just doing Outlook. They're making weapon systems for us now. So that has been unique because What it does is compress the sales cycle. So when these small companies or commercial entities that have to move quickly in order to survive in those environments, they have to have that. And the traditional defense firms like it a lot too. The challenge is going to be was with one of them fails and how we handle that with the congressional committees. Because failing in development happens all the time. You have to embrace it, but you have to harvest something, learn, and adjust. So, we have developmental systems that are going to be prototypes landing for the next year in particular. And they're not all going to be successful. And it's how General McConville and I and others are going to stand in front of those teams, defend them in front of Congress so that we can buy them more time to adjust, for example. With respect to talent, Congressman's right, we haven't pulled the trigger on that because a lot of that is cultural. We are creatures of our experience and in many ways tribal in the department. You get an officer record brief when you recruit your new staff, when we change that every year, every other year, and it's 101st, 82nd Ranger Regiment. Like, oh, I love them, get them in here. Right away, you haven't even met them yet because you're comfortable with that. And that's how it affects you on the boards when you get to promotions. One of the things we're pretty excited about, and we're nervous too, I'm going to touch wood as I say this, we've changed the battalion commander assessment program in the Army. And it's like the NFL Combine now. They come in there and they got to do a physical battery, a cognitive piece, and we're really looking them over because the battalion commanders is such an important job because you're the real touch for lieutenants and retention of officers. To the technical aspects that the Congressman described, that's been a tougher one because to the point of saying like, well, this person has a PhD in physics from MIT and they're this extraordinarily credentialed individual. But how do you bring them in as a lieutenant colonel, a colonel, a major, and getting people over the hump with that, it literally has risen to mine at General McConville's level. So it's going to take time to get through that.
Leanne, if you could, I want to bring you on a kind of cultural piece a little bit for industry and then also, again, for how you see it from where you sit within DoD. But, industry gets a knock sometimes for not being innovative. Not moving fast enough. And as Secretary MacArthur's old boss, Bob Gates, used to talk about, like, you need to find the 70% solutions, not the Christmas tree with all the trimmings on it that takes 9 or 9 years for a pistol. Can you, do you see where industry sits now? Are you innovating? Are you innovating at the rate you want to innovate? And what are the biggest obstacles to moving faster?
Well, I'm really glad you asked the question, Gordon, because what's, one of the myths that I would like to break here is that the traditional defense primes aren't innovative. That's actually part of the finding of the study, which, with all due respect, I don't totally concur with. Now, you all would expect me to do that and perhaps actually get defensive about it, but I'm not because historically, I think we have helped create that narrative. What we realized a few years back is that we cannot continue to operate the way we have always operated. One, we can't wait for any service to say, here is a set of requirements that are going to be out there, and then that's day one for us, and then build it in a traditional way that we've always built it. And so when I shared with you the 3 lenses of innovation, I shared there's the technology. One of the ways we're going off and doing that in the Boeing company is we actually have now a venture capital arm that we are off investing in small startups around the globe. And we're bringing them in and we're helping to see if their technology will go to the next level. If they fail fast, that's great, we move on because it is all about making certain you have a path forward. If it has tenets of success, is that something that we need to keep compartmentalized so we don't lose that secret sauce? Or do we want to bring it into the main business? So that's one way we're actually out there interacting from a startup perspective. Because we even heard in the prior presentation how there's a different thinking between a $100 billion company, and a $10 million startup. Two different cultures, 2 different environments. But the second element that I think is extremely important is that we talk a lot about 4th gen technology, 5th gen technology, and 6th gen technology, whether it's in regard to rotorcraft or fighters, whatever it may be. I believe 6th gen is about the design and manufacturing process. This is about how do we create digital products that have maintainability and sustainability built in line so they have a longer runway. And I'll give you an example, and you heard General Goldfein highlighted in the services chief panel, replacing the T-38 with the T-7. We started on our T-7 journey many years ago. We made some purposeful investments by staying close to and understanding what are some of the pressure points that the services are going to see from a training perspective going forward. We looked at it through the lens of not an aircraft, but a training system. How do we create a different experience for those who are going to go learn to fly and fight? But then when we actually put pencil to paper and we started investing, within 3 years from design start to first flight, we were flying the aircraft. And then within 50 flights, within 1 year, we were able to demonstrate that we had as much capability, actually better capability, than existing aircraft that had been in the fleet for more than 20 years. And so when we say that big aerospace defense primes don't innovate, what we probably don't do is help tell our story as well as we should. But that's how we actually attract and recruit new talent, because everybody wants to be part of something bigger than themselves. People want to see that they have not only a job to do, but they're contributing in a big way. I'm a second-generation Boeing employee. My dad worked for the company for 42 years. My mom and dad met in the Saturn V factory outside New Orleans, Louisiana. I was born down at the Cape. I've been with the company 31 years. You don't have a family history of 73 years, and hopefully longer,
Right.
Unless you believe in what not only the mission and the purpose is, but how we go about doing it. And then that ties to the third piece, which is the culture and retaining. Because you just don't retain on paychecks. You just don't retain on bonuses. You retain on mission, you retain on engagement, you retain on the things that matter to your workforce. And our workforce has evolved over time. What I wanted as a new employee back in 1988 is a lot different than somebody who's coming in the door today. And nobody today wants to wait around and, quote, pay their dues. So it's about having meaningful assignments early. It's about having passed to greater education. The Boeing company has spent $1.6 billion over the last 20 years on employee development and training alone.
Really?
Because that's important to us, because that's what the workforce is about.
So Gordon, one thing that we could add to help Leanne is a lot of it is the incentives from the customer and how we do business. I don't think that the Defense Department as a whole incentivizes the vendors to invest any R&D any deeper than 3 to 5 years. The incremental nature of upgrades, because look at most of our systems, 40, 50 years old. The platforms don't have much margin to grow unless you're going to go develop a brand new system. And a lot of that also is what are the types of, we're so prescriptive in an RFP, blue suit, green shirt, white, we don't allow them the latitude to be as innovative as they truly can be. So a lot of us are behavior.
Congress.
Mr. Secretary, I totally agree with you. And a lot of that's our fault in Congress because we don't provide the kind of budgetary authorities and the types of contracting authorities to make these long-term investments. But from a perspective of whether Boeing or Apple or Google is the most innovative company, I don't think it really matters if we have that debate up here so much as it matters that we actually have more of a free market system where everybody can compete. Mm-hmm. And then let the most innovative company win. And maybe it's Boeing, maybe it's Apple, maybe it's a startup that none of us have heard of.
Maybe it's a combination.
Or maybe it's some combination, right? But we don't have a defense ecosystem where small growing companies or even some big ones can really compete. And that's a problem. And we've got to look at why we're making these decisions, why we have partnerships with some companies but not others. Why I had an IT guy in my office on Friday, and we were just talking about his job, and he says he spends 90% of his time in the House of Representatives going into member offices and wiping computers to get them rid of viruses. 90% of his time. He said, Seth, I've been working for you for 4 years, and I have not had a single virus on any of your computers in any of your offices. And it's not because we have great antivirus software. It's for one simple reason. We have all Macs, and they don't get viruses. So I kind of wonder, why is there not an Apple partnership with DoD? And I don't even know the answer to that, Mr. Secretary. But there are probably a lot of issues that span everything from traditional contracting procedures to culture, to our outreach to Silicon Valley. It means that, our DoD computers are all running on Microsoft and they crash all the time. So these are some of the fundamental questions that I think we need to ask here when you think about these questions about who's innovative and who's not.
I just wanted, Leanne, just to follow up, what is it that, to kind of expand on this idea of what DoD could be doing from your standpoint to move the ball forward faster?
Secretary McCarthy and I have spent a lot of time working together over the years. It is about partnership. I actually dislike the word vendor. Vendor implies an impartial, uncaring relationship where a product or a service is handed over in exchange for something of value. The best way for us to innovate, the best way for us to continue to make certain that the United States has an unfair advantage over all of our peer competitors is to have these partnerships. And what we have found, and I think I speak for many of my counterparts at other companies, is that when we're able to have the conversations about what is it that the service is trying to achieve, how does it align to the national security strategy, where can we partner together? As an industry, you will find us continuing to invest. And from an R&D perspective, we have collectively, you have continued to see us invest through some of the toughest budget days to even through some of these growth times. And as we look forward, Gordon, we're seeing that the budgets are not only going to flatten out, they're probably going to decrease again. That's what we're anticipating. So how are we smart, making sure we are putting our money where we can further advance where the services want to go? That's part of the partnership.
Just a quick comment on this. I mean, look, to maybe spark a little bit of controversy, the only thing that you said, Mr. Secretary, that I maybe disagree with is this idea that, look, we just need to increase defense budgets and that's going to solve our problems. And look, I understand that at the Reagan National Defense Forum, I could have lunch with all the people who think defense budgets need to go down in that plastic tent outside, because that's about as many people as we'd attract. But my point is this: it's not so much whether defense budgets need to go up or go down. That's not the first question. My position is that we need to improve our national security. And there's a very obvious, second point, which is that maybe that means you need to increase defense budgets. But China, which is our main adversary, is taking a whole of government approach to winning in the Pacific. They have invested about $200 billion in their Belt and Road Initiative, just in the sort of Indo-Pac AR, all right? The State Department budget for FY20 in the Indo-Pacific is $1.8 billion. $200 billion is an interesting number because it's exactly twice the Marshall Plan budget from 1948 in 2018 dollars. It was about $100 billion. For America to make a commitment of $100 billion, or perhaps match China's commitment of $200 billion in aid and development to the Pacific, is a huge budgetary. That's not going to easily get through Congress. But that's something that we need to consider if we're going to effectively compete. And so the question is not just, would the Army like $100 billion more? Of course. You're never going to find anyone in the Army or at Boeing or any service secretary who's like, sure, give me more money. But the question is, if you had $100 billion, is it better spent to beat China by giving it to the Army or by providing an alternative to Belt and Road? And I think that that's an open question that we need to answer. And there has to be a comprehensive strategy. It shouldn't be just the State Department competing with DoD. There has to be a comprehensive strategy across government to figure out how to spend what will probably be more limited resources. Remember this, we now have the largest budget deficit in American history, thanks to the recent tax cut. So we don't have a lot of resources. So budgets may actually go down. And in that environment, how do we spend these dollars as effectively as we can to compete against our now greatest adversary?
Good. So there's a couple questions about the task force report I want to get back to real quick in our 6 minutes and 43 seconds. However, because you talked about kind of strategy, I think this is germane. I think the Pentagon and the U.S. generally is at a kind of a inflection point on the national defense strategy, which dictates or kind of mandates X, Y, and Z. Russia and particularly China, and focus and resources and bandwidth. The enemy gets a vote is such a cliche, but the enemy does get a vote. I guess my question to anybody who wants to take it on is how much in our current state here between Asia and the Middle East, distracts from these bigger kind of strategic challenges that we're up here talking about today anyway.
I guess
Ryan,
that
what-
was mine, right, Gordon?
Yeah.
To the congressman's point, what I would say is I was an appointee for Bush, Obama, and now Trump administrations all in a row. And obviously, it's been the same demand worldwide under all three administrations. The U.S. Army is in 140 countries, 182,000 people forward, 182,000 getting ready, and 182,000 just got home. So demand plays a big role here. To the congressman's point, how do you compete against China and Russia? Is it in a three-point stance staring at them from Eastern Europe towards Russia, or is it in South America? Is it in Africa, so that you prevent, to his point, the strength and energy behind One Belt, One Road? And what are the relationships that you are trying to forge in the various continents around the world? Because all the money he described is to tie around the globe. So that's where the department is putting the preponderance of its energy at the senior most level of how do we compete and where, and the choices that you have to make. But I would double down on this. We do need more money if we're going to continue to compete globally against the behemoth that is China, as well as Russia, as well as North Korea and Iran. And to Gordon's point, the violent extremist threats that still exist around the world present, in some cases, existential threats to the homeland. And the U.S. military will be out there to meet that threat and play an away game, so we don't want to hear it home.
Got it. There's a good question here, and we'll kind of wrap up maybe with this, but it's I think appropriate here. The question is about how the government can harness technologies that we see in the private sector, AI and the like, and use these internal, really experimental programs like DIU-X. I was sad that they dropped the X on that. Army Futures Command.
Well, you know why, Gordon? It's not an experiment anymore. It's real.
But it's supposed to be I would argue that it's supposed to be ongoing experiments. But anyway, how do you expand those kinds of initiatives across the department so they're not these kind of like, boutique initiatives? At least for DoD-wide, DIU is still kind of a small thing. How do you broaden it and make it succeed and get the private sector interested in working with DoD?
We created a 4-star command. We rewired the Army, bringing all the stakeholders in the modernization continuum under one roof. We moved it and put it in the middle of an American city, Austin, Texas, where there are no fences or tanks out in front of the headquarters, and they wear civilian clothes. We are trying to be a better customer. We cut $30 billion worth of programs across the FIDP and moved, as I laid out the ratios, against our investment priorities. So we're putting our money where our mouth is to show this is where we're going as an institution. We are trying to behave differently, but we are 15 months into the standing up of that command. The investment portfolios of the 6 that I mentioned are led by a 1-star, 2-star general, and a program executive, so it is one-stop shopping to try to prevent companies making investments to create legions of government relations people to go flood the Pentagon. Now you go to one place. Try to make it simple and try to be a better customer and improve relationships with academia and business. And the headquarters is laid in on the University of Texas and an accelerator hub, so we're right there with academia and business.
Either of you two?
There's a lot that Congress needs to do here, because look, the Secretary has a tough hand. He's got these commitments around the globe, and it is difficult to meet these requirements. I mean, in your position, I'd be asking for more money as well. But the point is that it's up to the administration more broadly, but Congress to have that oversight role and say, we're the ones who need to say, we need to relook at our commitments and our overall strategy, and maybe we should be putting a little bit more money here or there. And that means that some of these commitments for our national security that are currently being held down or covered down on by the Army need to be covered down on by the State Department. So there's a lot that comes back to us in how we meet the demands of this changing world. Because right now we've given a difficult hand to the Secretary. On the Future Defense Task Force this week, we had Hacking for Defense come in. It's an amazing program where college students across the country are solving cutting-edge problems for DoD. And it was even cited by the Institute report as exactly the kind of model program that we should be investing more in. At the end of the presentation, we said, what does this cost? What is the budget for hacking for defense? And the answer was $1 million. It sounds like a line from a Jim Carrey film, right? I almost thought it was a joke. $1 million for one of the most innovative programs that we have right now in DoD. So that's a little bit on organizations like the Army, but a lot on Congress to say that we've got to put our money where our mouth is and really invest in the kinds of future capabilities that we need to compete in this new world.
But just because it doesn't cost a lot of money doesn't mean it's not highly.
It doesn't mean it's not effective, but it's really hard to justify why, if you have a very, very effective program for a mere $1 million, you don't continue to invest it. DIU that you just brought up. The only reason it's funded at all right now is because a bipartisan group of veterans went around the House floor working against House appropriations, which had zeroed out the program in last year's budget.
Right.
We had to fight tooth and nail to get that budget, to get that line item preserved. And it was a great example, a small example that no one in the public really got to see of a bipartisan group of veterans coming together and making that happen 2 years ago, I think it was. But the point is, there are a lot of people in Congress who are against it.
Still a lot to work on. Anyway, we're out of time. Really appreciate our panelists talking up here, and let's give them a hand. Thanks so much.